JP Sottile, a freelance journalist, radio host, and filmmaker, and also a contributor to Truthout, is here to talk about the rebranding of the U.S. Army School of the Americas and the continuation of its mission in places like Central America and Africa. Just exactly what that mission is the topic of his article entitled School of the Americas Morphs into U.S. Training Industrial Complex. Hey, JP, welcome to Truthout Interviews.
Good to be with you, Ted. I guess this makes this my first TED Talk.
Yes, it does. This is your first TED Talk. Unfortunately, it's a different kind of TED Talk, but I guess we'd call it the cheaper version.
No, it's good. Hey, I like being with the people.
There you go. A lot of people may not know what the School of the Americas is about. So maybe you could explain a little bit about what this school is historically and what it's morphed into today.
In 1946, the School of the Americas was established in the Panama Canal Zone as a training facility, in a sense, whereby the United States would spread U.S. military doctrine around Central and South America. This was before the Cold War started in earnest, but remember, the United States has had a long history of military involvement in and around Central and South America, going back really 200 years. There's an amazing piece that was put out by Radio Australia, of all places, based on a Congressional Research Service report that just came out, detailing 200 years of American intervention. It's actually the very first hyperlink in the story, which I recommend everybody check out. And when you look at the long list of the places and the number of times the United States has intervened around the world, and specifically in Central and South America, you can see that military involvement in Central and South America has been number one at the top of military planning. And this is why the School of the Americas was originally established. But as the Cold War got hotter, ironically, the United States used the School of the Americas in the Panama Canal Zone to create, in a sense, an ad hoc roving army of anti-communist shock troops in countries in and around Central and South America. They would be involved in reciprocal relationships with U.S. military personnel. And in a sense, what happened over the course of the 50s and the 60s is that the United States was able to place military personnel, in a sense, people with relationships and training with U.S. military forces in key positions in countries in and around Central and South America. And a lot of these personnel that the United States trained and cooperated with through the auspices of the School of the Americas ended up being involved in coups, massacres, human rights abuses, and it was an important lever of power that the United States could pull in places like Guatemala, Chile, Honduras, Mexico. The list goes on and on.
Yeah, this kind of goes back to the Monroe Doctrine and that sphere of influence in that, outside of North America proper, and just spilling over into places like Central America and even South America, as you mentioned. But this school has rebranded itself. It's no longer called the School of the Americas, where it trains anti-communist insurgents. It's more about, as your article points out, that with this rebranding comes this rebranding of perpetual war. But the war is now about drugs and about terrorism.
The problem came about 1989. That's when the problem really hit in terms of a public relations problem. That's when 6 Jesuits were massacred in San Salvador, the University of Central America, as a matter of fact. And former trainees, SOA graduates, were involved in this massacre. The Jesuits were killed, their housekeeper was killed, and the housekeeper's daughter was killed.
It was a cover-up, too. There was a bit of a cover-up on these.
And there was a cover-up, but it wasn't covered up for long. It turned into a huge public relations nightmare. And throughout the 90s, what happened was that members of Congress began to become more motivated to pull the plug on the School of the Americas. Of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was that, for those of us old enough to remember the Cold War, there was this feeling around the Cold War that, well, we have to fight the commies. So we have to do some, as Dick Cheney said, in terms of fighting terrorism, we have to go to the dark side a little bit to deal with terrorism. Well, we did a lot, we as the United States, and saying the United States did a lot of going to the dark side and fighting communism. Well, once the war against commies was over and the 90s kind of took hold, Congress started to look more closely at what was going on with the School of the Americas. Of course, there was in the middle in 1990, I want to say 1996, presidential commission was looking at U.S. involvement in Guatemala. A lot of what happened in Guatemala started to come out in 1996. The infamous training manuals came out. There were 7 of these manuals. One of them goes back to Project X in the 1960s, but many of these manuals were developed in 1987, 1980, 89. They showed students how to hire assassins, how to use truth serum, engage in essentially torture, to kill political opponents, often political opponents were labor activists, were land rights activists. So by the time you get to 2000, the School of the Americas is basically untenable. And Congress is very, very close to getting rid of it, just pulling the funding and pulling it completely. Well, Secretary of the Army under then President Bill Clinton came up with this wonderful idea of rebranding it. What if we just officially close the school in 2000 and then reopen it and call it WHINSEC, the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, one of these wonderful acronyms. It's so long, and it worked. And maybe one of the reasons why, SOA Watch, School of America's Watch, still goes out there. They just held their 25th annual vigil, a vigil that was inspired in no small part by that 1989 massacre of the Jesuits. The rebranding that Luis Caldera orchestrated actually worked because the stories that came out after the school was officially closed were, in ABC News and other places, School of America closed. And it kind of washed it clean from the public consciousness, and WHINSEC was allowed to go on. As of November 14th, 389 students had come to WHINSEC from 19 countries to do much of what was done during the Cold War. Now the training has been scrubbed clean, but now that harder training, I believe, is being done overseas, further out of sight and out of public scrutiny.
What this School of Americas was trying to do was make these parts of the world safe for capitalism and reinforce their turf and say, this is our hemisphere, going back again to the Monroe Doctrine, whether it's European imperialists or whether it's communists, or now, as it seems to have morphed into the drug war and also the conflation of terrorism and the war on drugs. I think you mentioned that they call it narco-terrorism.
Yeah, narco-terrorism. This is what Plan Colombia is all about. Plan Colombia, very controversial when it was instituted at the end of the Clinton administration, the beginning of the Bush administration. You get Plan Colombia. It's about fighting narco-terrorists in Colombia. Well, okay, you make this great point. Ostensibly, everything was about fighting communists, and then it became, at the end of the 80s, for the school, as far as the School of the Americas was concerned, it was about leveraging it more now towards the training towards defeating narco-terrorists or drug trafficking, because of course the war on drugs in the 80s, big issue. Well, they knew that the Cold War was coming to an end. We need to come up with something else. So how about a war on drugs writ large around the world? Now it's also war on terrorism. And now we have war on narco-terrorism. I'm just waiting for commie narco-terrorists. I mean, once you get the trifecta, we'll forget about it. That you'll be able to fund that to the tune of billions. But really what it comes down to often is that nationalization of resources. If a democratically elected official or president or leader, a prime minister, anywhere in the world, but specifically in Central and South America, if they threaten to nationalize resources, redistribute land, do anything that gets in the way of interests like United Fruit Company in the 50s and 60s, which becomes Chiquita Banana. Chiquita Banana heavily involved in Colombia, heavily leveraged into Plan Colombia, where Plan Colombia is supposedly fighting narco-terrorists, but often what it is the United States and the Colombian government are paying their own narcotics traffickers to defeat other narcotic traffickers who have also, by the way, begun promising land reform to people who work on banana plantations, and Chiquita Banana doesn't want that. And now Chiquita Banana gets busted recently by the Department of Justice and fined for hiring right-wing hit squads to go and kill their political opponents. And often, as you point out, these things end up being economic rationales. There's really an economic war. It's not an ideological war. The communist versus capitalist thing almost muddies the issue. The ideology is fogged. The real issue is who controls the resources. And now that you have oil in places like Venezuela, you have oil in Colombia, you have oil being discovered just about everywhere. How about Honduras, where I didn't even know this before I started writing this piece, where gold is a big issue, and U.S. interests and Canadian interests very interested in having that gold be accessible, which is partially why they supported a 2009 coup, which had links to WINSEC, also known as the School of Americas.
Yeah, and it all comes back to, in a sense, protecting corporate capitalist interests. That's really what it's for to me as I read through this, your article. A theme keeps arising, and that is any kind of land reforms, any kind of things to give more equity to the people who actually, grow and cut the bananas or grow and cut the sugar cane. That's got to be shut down because that will disrupt the profit margins of these corporate interests. One of the things that you highlight in your article, and earlier this year we had this, and the media had characterized it as this flood of children that were coming from Central America and crashing over our borders and coming into our system. And the reaction, the violent reaction of Americans here in the United States, especially down in the southern part of California, against these children trying to be transported to a detention center. And it's like, not in my backyard. But what was missing in that coverage from the media was why these children were coming from places like Honduras. And you highlighted in your article, first off, yes, you said that there's gold there, but there are other things there that you said it's the murder capital of basically Central America, or maybe this part of the hemisphere.
That is actually that's the genesis of this story for me. That's where it started. I put out a daily newsletter, and so I'm looking at about 150 news sites every morning beginning at 5 a.m., and I send out this newsletter, compile, aggregate news. And I saw this story in the middle of the Honduran refugee crisis, child refugee, whatever it was branded as. And it was very odd to me that I noted, it was an Atlanta Journal-Constitution story, that U.S. National Guardsmen from the 48th Brigade out of Fort Benning were going to Honduras at the same time these kids were fleeing Honduras to come to America. And I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting thing. That's something I haven't heard about. So I poked around, and lo and behold, not only is did the United States, say we want democracy to prevail, but there was a 2009 coup. The coup was led by people closely tied to and trained by U.S. military forces through WINSEC and School of Americas originally. And then you have this base, an air base, being run by the United States to run counter-narcotics efforts inside Honduras. And then all of a sudden you find out, oh, well, Honduras has been the murder capital of the world for a couple of years running. Oh, and then you dig a little bit more. Members of Congress actually asked the State Department, right around the same time as this Honduran child refugee crisis began, asked the State Department to review its support for the Honduran regime because of excessive human rights violations on the part of security and military forces. Those are the security and military forces that the troops are flying out of Fort Benning to go to Honduras to train. So the people that the United States are trained are now being implicated by members of Congress and asking the State Department to investigate the human rights abuses that then contribute to what may be the murder capital of the world, which then leads to child refugees coming to the United States.
Yet what all we hear is that these children who bring diseases to our country are coming in waves and waves, and the president is doing nothing to stop it. So there's a lot of grandstanding, which is, gee, that's new for politics, right? So, but I'm glad that you had a chance to look at this and bring it to light in your article, because I found it very illuminating. It's a very thorough piece. I encourage everyone to read it and to share it with their social networks. And JP, I want to thank you for being on Truthout Interviews.
Thank you for allowing me to bloviate and be a little bit long-winded.
No worries. The article is called School of the Americas Morphs into U.S. Training Industrial Complex. Thanks for watching Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Asregadoo, and we'll see you next time.